I used to believe humiliation only happened in movies, big dramatic scenes, people shouting, crowds pointing, but real humiliation. It's smaller than that, quieter, sharper. It happens when people you trust make you feel invisible while everyone is watching it. Happened to me at a company celebration, one of those mandatory events where smiling is required and honesty is dangerous. I had been working there for 3 years. Never late, never complained, never caused problems. I was the kind of employee managers liked and coworkers ignored until that night. The company rented a restaurant downtown, expensive too, bright too loud. I wore my best clothes. Not because I wanted attention, but because I wanted respect at least once. When I arrived, I noticed the looks. Quick glances and whispers. I didn't understand why, not yet. The night moved forward. Drinks, speeches, fake applause. Then came the moment, the microphone, the jokes. My manager stood up, smiling, confident. Holding a glass, he started talking about teamwork, about loyalty, about learning experiences. Then he said my name. The room went quiet. He laughed and said, "Let's talk about what not to do at work." People laughed, not hard, just enough. He told a story about a mistake I made months earlier, something small, something already resolved, but he twisted it, exaggerated it, made it sound like incompetence. Then my coworkers joined in one comment. Then another, someone said, "At least he tries." Another said, "Confidence matters more than skill." I stood there frozen, smiling, because that's what you do when you're being humiliated. You smile. So they don't see the damage. That night, I didn't speak, I didn't defend myself. I didn't react, I just listened, and I remembered every voice. Asterisk. The next morning, no one apologized, not my manager, not my coworkers, not even HR. Instead, they avoided eye contact. If I had embarrassed them by allowing myself to be humiliated, when I learned something important, people don't regret cruelty. They regret being reminded of I kept working, same hours, same effort, but something had changed. I stopped sharing ideas, stopped volunteering, stopped trusting. I became invisible on purpose. Mistook my silence for weakness, for defeat. They were wrong. At home, I replayed everything, every word, every laugh, not with anger, but with clarity. I started documenting things. Emails, messages, decisions. I learned who took credit, who lied, who blamed others. I didn't rush. I didn't confront. I waited, because real revenge doesn't explode, it erodes slowly, quietly. Asterisk. 3 months passed after that night. 3 quiet months. On the surface, everything looked normal. Emails, meetings, deadlines, but underneath, something was shifting. I noticed it first in small ways. Conversations stopped when I walked into a room. Meetings happened without me. Decisions were made, then announced, not discussed. At first, I thought it was coincidence. I told myself, you're imagining it, you're being sensitive. That's what humiliation teaches you, to doubt your own instincts. But then came the email. The subject line was simple: upcoming promotion announcement. My heart didn't race, not any more. Hope had learned to walk quietly in me. The email said the promotion would be announced at the next team meeting. A new role, more responsibility, higher pay. I had been doing that role already unofficially for over a year, training new hires, fixing other people's mistakes, covering when managers were absent. Even my performance reviews said it exceeds expectations. Reliable, consistent. I didn't expect gratitude, but I expected fairness. Day of the meeting arrived. I sat at the far end of the table, notebook closed, pen untouched. My manager stood at the front, same confident smile, same practice tone. He talked about growth, about loyalty, about recognizing talent. Then he said the name. It wasn't mine, it was Daniel. Daniel had joined 6 months ago, friendly, loud, always joking. He was good at one thing, taking credit. I looked around the room. No one looked surprised. That's when it hit me. This wasn't sudden. This had been decided long ago. Manager praised Daniel, listed achievements. I recognized, because they were mine projects. I led problems, I solved crises. I handled. Daniel nodded, smiling, accepting applause. He looked at me for half a second, just long enough, not apologetic, not guilty, proud. The meeting ended. People congratulated him, clapped him on the back. No one said anything to me, not even, "I'm sorry." That silence, it told me everything. That night, I didn't feel anger, I felt clarity. Humiliation hurts, but betrayal educates. I went home, opened my laptop, and started organizing not emotionally, methodically emails, timestamps, meeting notes. I wasn't planning revenge, yet not consciously. I was planning understanding. I needed to know how this system worked, who pulled strings, who benefited, who covered for whom. Because this wasn't about Daniel. Daniel was just a tool. Over the next few weeks, I paid attention. I listened more, spoke less. People reveal more when they think you're irrelevant. I learned that my manager had been missing targets, deadlines pushed, budgets adjusted quietly. I learned Daniel's promotion wasn't about talent, it was about loyalty. My manager needed someone who wouldn't question him, someone loud enough to distract and shallow enough to obey. Daniel fit perfectly. I also learned something else. HR wasn't blind, they were careful. They documented problems, but waited for patterns, for leverage. That detail stayed with me. One afternoon, Daniel asked me for help, just like old times. He leaned over my desk, smiling casual. "Hey, can you walk me through this report?" I looked at him, at the confidence, the comfort. He assumed I would say yes, because I always had. He nodded, not because I wanted to help, but because I wanted access. As I explained the report, I noticed his confusion. He didn't understand half of it. Relied on shortcuts, on summaries, on other people. That's when I realized he wasn't prepared. He was positioned, and positions are fragile. Weeks past, Daniel struggled quietly, missed details, overlooked risks. My manager covered for him, adjusted timelines, redirected. Blame, but pressure doesn't disappear, it accumulates, and cracks begin to show. Clients ask questions, finance ask questions, upper management ask questions. Daniel came to me more often for clarification, for explanations. I always helped, calm, patient, professional, not because I forgave, but because I understood something important. If you want someone to follow, you don't push them. You let them stand on what they can't hold. One evening, as I was leaving, I overheard a conversation. My manager on the phone in his office. The door was slightly open. He sounded tense. Deadlines, audits, reviews, words he never used before. Fear changes people, it sharpens them. I walked past quietly. That was the moment the idea formed. Not revenge, not yet opportunity. I went home and wrote something down. Not names, not accusations, a simple sentence. They humiliated me publicly. Now they underestimate me privately. That sentence became my anchor whenever doubt crept in, whenever I wondered if I should just quit. I read it and stayed, because leaving would have given them peace, and peace is something I was no longer willing to give. By the end of that quarter, the company announced an internal review process, performance, accountability. Daniel looked nervous. My manager looked tired. I looked invisible, and invisible is exactly where power hides. That S when the first quiet move began, not dramatic, not obvious, just a small shift. I stopped fixing mistakes before they were seen. I let processes follow their natural path. Through official channels, I documented everything, not to expose, but to preserve, because truth doesn't need decoration, it just needs time. Asterisk, power changes people, but pressure reveals them. Once the internal review was announced, everything shifted, not loudly, not officially, but in the way people spoke, in the way emails were written, in the way meetings suddenly mattered. My manager started arriving earlier, leaving later. Daniel stopped joking. The room felt tighter, like everyone was holding their breath. That's when I began to see what had always been there. The weakness, it wasn't a secret scandal or something dramatic. It was something far more dangerous. My manager cut corners, not recklessly, carefully. He delayed reports, adjusted timelines, moved numbers between departments, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to survive quarterly pressure. I had noticed it before, but never understood its importance. Now I did, because the review wasn't about mistakes, it was about patterns. And patterns don't lie. The first sign came in an email, sent late, marked urgent. Finance requested documentation supporting numbers from previous quarters. My manager forwarded it to Daniel. Daniel forwarded it to Mano. Explanation, just need this ASAP. I opened the files. What I saw wasn't fraud, but it wasn't clean either. Missing approvals, revised forecasts, verbal confirmations instead of written ones. Things that only work until someone asks questions. I felt a familiar pull, the instinct to fix, to protect, to make it easier for everyone. That instinct had kept me invisible for years. This time I didn't follow. ID responded calmly. I explained what I could. I attached what existed. And I documented what didn't. No accusations, no commentary just. Facts are heavy. Even when delivered quietly days later, my manager called me into his office. He closed the door, smiled too carefully. He thanked me for being reliable, for helping the team. Then he asked almost casually if finance comes back with more questions. Let me handle it. That was the first time he acknowledged my presence. Since the humiliation, I nodded and said nothing, because I had learned silence unsettles people who are hiding something. Daniel started coming to me daily, not as a peer, but as a lifeline. He asked how things used to be done, who approved which reports mattered. I answered truthfully, but merely I gave him procedures, not protection. He didn't notice. He was too busy surviving. As the review progressed, small meetings were scheduled, private ones, upper management, finance, HRMY. Manager wasn't invited to all of them, but detail mattered because exclusion is the first signal of loss one afternoon. I received a calendar invite, no explanation, just a time and a conference from HR. I almost declined. Old fear surfaced, but fear belongs to people who still think the system is fair. I accepted. The HR representative was polite, professional. She didn't accuse. She asked about processes, about reporting, about responsibilities. I answered honestly. I didn't volunteer information, but I didn't protect anyone either. That balance. It matters. She asked about the promotion. Why Daniel? Why not May? Pause, not for effect. For truth then, I said I was never considered. Her expression changed. Just slightly, she wrote something down. That pen movement, it felt heavier than any argument after that meeting. My manager avoided me. Daniel avoided everyone. The office grew quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like a storm holding itself back. At home, I reflected, not with excitement, not with joy, with control, because revenge isn't about watching someone fall. It's about choosing whether you catch them, and I was learning I didn't want to catch them anymore. The review continued, deadlines tightened, expectations sharpened. My manager snapped at people, lost patience, made mistakes, small ones, public ones. Daniel panicked, sent emails late, missed meetings. Upper management noticed, not because anyone complained, but because systems always expose the weak. When pressure is applied evenly. One evening, as I packed up to leave, my manager stopped me. He looked tired, older. He asked quietly if I ever felt undervalued. The question surprised me, not because it was asked, but because it came too late. I met his eyes and said, yes, nothing else, no blame, no story, just one word. That word hung in the air. He nodded, as if he understood, but understanding doesn't erase consequences. That night, I wrote another sentence. They built their power on shortcuts, and shortcuts disappear when the lights turn on. The lights were turning on slowly, quietly. By the end of the review, nothing had exploded, no announcements, no firings, just tension. The kind that precedes collapse. Daniel's confidence was gone. My manager's authority was thinning, and I was still invisible, which meant I was still free. Because when people don't see you, they don't defend against you, they don't prepare, they don't protect their weaknesses. Asterisk, there's a strange moment right before things change, not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet shift, like the air in a room before someone speaks the truth. I felt it the week after the review ended. Nothing had been announced, but everyone knew something was coming. It started with an email, short, careful, sent late in the evening. Do you have a few minutes tomorrow just to talk? It was from someone I rarely spoke to. Laura, she worked in compliance, not management, not HR. Compliance is where rules live, where people who hate attention quietly protect the company. She was known for being fair and invisible, which immediately caught my attention. We met in a small conference room. Glass walls, no decorations. She didn't smile much, didn't waste time. She thanked me for being consistent during the review. Then she said something that changed everything. You didn't try to protect anyone. I stayed quiet. She continued, that tells me a lot about you. People often mistake neutrality for loyalty. Laura didn't ask me questions, not about individuals, but about processes, where information stalled, who approved what usually got rushed. I answered carefully, truthfully, but without emotion, because emotion invites interpretation. Facts do not. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. The review hadn't ended, it had simply moved from performance to accountability, and accountability lies in compliance. She didn't say my manager's name, or Daniel didn't need to. She asked one final question. If we find what we think we might, Would you be willing to confirm documentation timelines? I understood what she was asking. Not to accuse, not to testify, just to confirm. What already existed, I nodded because, at this point, I wasn't choosing sides, I was choosing alignment with reality after that meeting. I felt something unfamiliar, not satisfaction relief, because for the first time I wasn't alone in what I saw over. The next few weeks, Lavra and I crossed paths more. Often brief conversations, quiet check-ins, never shared details. Never speculated, but she listened, and listening is a powerful form of respect. Meanwhile, things worsened for Daniel without backup. Without protection, he made decisions he didn't understand. Signed off on things he shouldn't have. My manager stopped correcting him, not because he trusted him, but because he was busy saving himself. That abandonment, it showed one morning. Daniel sat across from me, hands shaking slightly. He looked exhausted. Asked off the record, "Did I mess up?" I considered lying, but lies are heavy, and I was done carrying weight. "That wasn't mine," I said. "You were put somewhere." You weren't ready for not cruel, not comforting, just true. He didn't argue. That's how I knew he already understood. That same week, I was invited to another meeting, this one, with Laura, and someone from legal. They asked about documentation practices, specifically about email chains, wanted to understand why certain approvals were verbal. I explained the culture, fast-paced, results-driven, shortcuts, encouraged not by policy, but by pressure. The legal representative nodded. That nod, it meant more than words. After the meeting, Laura stopped Mesh, said something I'll never forget. "People think compliance is about rules. It's not, it's about memory." She was right, because organizations forget until someone remembers for them. At home, I thought about the word ally. I'd always believed allies were loud, protective, visible. Laura wasn't. She was precise, patient, unmovable, and she had no interest in revenge, only correction, which made her far more dangerous than anyone acting on emotion. The atmosphere at work became heavy. My manager stopped making jokes, stopped delegating. He hoarded decisions. Controlled access, that kind of behavior always accelerates collapse. One afternoon, he called an emergency meeting, tried to assert authority, reframe narratives. He spoke about transparency, about trust. The irony was painful. Daniel sat silently, eyes down. I watched, not with pleasure, with focus, because this wasn't about watching them suffer. It was about seeing how systems correct imbalance. Later that day, Laura sent me a message, 2 words: "Thank you." Nothing else. That message told me the gears were turning. That night, I wrote again, "An ally doesn't fight beside you. They make sure the truth can walk alone." That sentence felt complete. As weeks passed, upper management involvement increased, more audits, more oversight. My manager lost access to certain approvals. Daniel was reassigned, temporarily, quietly, no announcement, just movement. And through it all, no one confronted me, no one accused me, because I hadn't done anything except stop protecting lies. I realized something. Then revenge didn't feel like victory. It felt like alignment, like stepping out of the way and letting gravity do its job. By the end of that month, one thing was clear: this wasn't going to end with shouting or scenes. It was going to end with paperwork and silence. The most permanent kind. Asterisk from the outside. Everything looked fine. That's how collapse often begins, quiet on the surface, cracking underneath. The company announced a major client win, big contract, public celebration, internal praise. My manager was back on stage, smiling again, rehearsed confidence restored. Daniel was mentioned too. Briefly, carefully, the applause was polite. I clapped because that's what people do. When watching a performance, the celebration photos went up on the internal portal. Smiles, handshakes, raised glasses. Anyone looking in would assume stability, growth, leadership. But I knew better, because success, when it's used as a shield, eventually becomes a lie behind the scenes. The pressure multiplied. That new client came with oversight, strict timelines. External audits, shortcuts wouldn't survive this contract, and everyone knew it. My manager tried to regain control. He scheduled meetings, created task forces, demanded updates, but authority that has been questioned never returns cleanly. People complied, but they didn't trust. They documented everything, including him. Daniel struggled visibly. He spoke less, hesitated more. Confidence had been replaced with fear. Fear makes people reckless. He rushed approvals, misread documents, relied on assumptions. Each mistake small but cumulative. One afternoon, he sent a report with an attachment, the wrong attachment, sensitive data. Meant for internal review, it was caught, quickly, quietly, but it was locked. Compliance doesn't forget I watched all of this from the edges, not interfering, not correcting. I did my work exceptionally. I met deadlines, followed process. I became boring, and boring people are rarely suspected. The new client requested a walkthrough of internal controls compliance. Let it. Laura spoke clear, prepared. She didn't accuse, she explained, and explanations reveal more than accusations. My manager sat quietly, taking notes, not leading. That detail mattered. After the meeting, upper management pulled Laura aside. Private conversation. Serious expressions. I didn't hear a word. I didn't need to. The room felt different afterward. Heavier. Final. Daniel approached me later, desperate. He asked if I could help clean things up. That phrase, it meant shortcuts. I looked at him and said, "We should follow the process." He nodded, but his eyes told me he knew it was too late. That night I thought about masks, how people wear them when they feel exposed to public success. Private decay. The gap between those two things is where consequences live. The next week, my manager called in sick once and again. Daniel took charge. Unprepared meetings, stalled decisions, delayed. Upper management stepped in, not aggressively, but deliberately. That's when you know leadership has lost faith. In email went out announcing temporary oversight, adjustments, neutral language, permanent implications. I received another message from Laura, short, professional. "Thank you for your consistency." Consistency, that word meant everything, because consistency is what systems reward, not loyalty, not noise. At work, people started treating me differently, not warmly, not coldly, carefully, as if I suddenly mattered. That shift, it felt strange, not empowering, sobering. Daniel was reassigned again, this time not quietly, still no announcement, but everyone knew. My manager stopped appearing in meetings. His calendar emptied. That's when absence becomes visible. I didn't celebrate, I didn't smile. I felt something closer to mourning, because I realized they weren't villains. They were flawed people who mistook power for immunity, and learned too late that systems don't hate you, they just don't protect you either. One evening, as I packed up, I passed my manager's office. Lights off, desk clean, nameplate removed, no farewell email, no goodbye, just emptiness. That image stayed with me, not because it felt good, but because it felt final. Success had been their shield, their performance, but shields crack when pressure comes from all sides, and pressure always comes asterisk. There is a moment in every long wait when patience turns into choice, not the loud kind, not the dramatic kind, the kind that asks how far. Are you willing to go? I didn't expect that moment to come after everything had already started collapsing, but it did quietly with my manager gone. And Daniel sidelined. The office felt hollow, like a building after a storm, still standing, but changed. People spoke softer, moved slower. Everyone knew they were being watched. That's when the requests began, not official ones, not documented, personal ones. A coworker pulled me aside, asked if I knew anything. Another hinted that maybe I could help explain things to make them less bad. I said the same thing every time. I don't know more than what's written, because truth should never need translation then. Laura contacted me again this time. Her tone was different, not cautious, measured. She asked if I could meet one last time. The room was the same, glass walls, neutral air, but the presence of legal changed everything. They laid out documents, printed, organized email chains, approval logs, timestamps. The story was complete. They didn't need me to explain it, they needed me to confirm it. Laura looked at me, not as an investigator, but as a person. She said, "This will end someone's career," not as a warning, as a fact. That's when the line appeared, not between right and wrong, but between necessity and mercy. I thought about that night at the restaurant, the laughter, the smiles, the way they made me small, but I also thought about the present, quiet office, empty desks, people who would be affected beyond the guilty. Laura gave me space. She understood that justice isn't automatic, it's a decision. I asked one question. Is this about punishment or correction? She answered without hesitation. Correction. That word, it mattered, because punishment is emotional, correction is structural, and structure is what lasts. I confirmed the timelines, the documentation, process deviations. I didn't add commentary. I didn't speculate. I didn't embellish. I let the facts speak. When the meeting ended, Laura thanked me, not warmly, not casually, with respect. That respect, it felt heavier than any apology I never received after. That things moved quickly, not publicly, Not dramatically, just efficiently legal notices. Process updates, role realignments, Daniel resigned, no farewell message, my manager's name disappeared. From Records Clean Clinical in May was offered something unexpected, a position not. Daniel's not my manager's, a new role focused on process integrity, visibility, accountability. I didn't accept immediately, power earned through collapse. Feels different, Ty. Needed time at home, I sat with the decision, not about the job, about myself. Had I become what I hated? Had I waited? Just to watch someone follow the answers surprised me. Oh, because I hadn't pushed, I hadn't lied, I hadn't manipulated, I had stopped intervening, and in a system built on shortcuts, that alone was enough. The humiliation, the betrayal, they weren't the end. They were the lesson that silence can be strength, that patience can be power, and that revenge doesn't have to look like destruction. I accepted the role not as a reward, as a responsibility. The first thing I did was change one small process. Reporting requirement tip made shortcuts impossible, not for revenge, but for protection for whoever came next. That's when I realized the line I faced was never about them, it was about who I would become. Asterisk, by the time everything was decided. There was no tension left, no fear, no urgency, just motion. That's how you know something is finished, not when it explodes, but when it stops resisting. My new role came with visibility, but not power, at least not the kind people noticed. I wasn't managing people. I was managing flow, information, approvals, accountability, the kind of work that prevents stories like mine from repeating. There were no confrontations, no one pulled me aside to apologize. My manager never reached out. Daniel never asked for closure. They didn't need to, because endings don't always require conversation. The office reorganized itself, new reporting lines, new procedures, new habits, people adjusted quickly. That's another truth. Organizations don't mourn individuals, they absorb absence. I passed my manager's old team one afternoon, new faces, new energy, no trace of what had happened. That absence, it felt surreal. For years I had imagined a momenta, look, a realization, some acknowledgement, but it never came in. I realized it wasn't necessary, Laura, and I spoke less, not because something changed, but because the work was done. Allies serve a purpose. They don't linger. One evening I stayed late, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I walked through the office, empty desks, muted lights. I stopped at the conference room, the same one where I'd been humiliated. The room looked smaller, now less threatening, just furniture and glass. That's what time said. Shrinks monsters. I sat down, not to relive, but to release, because revenge had quietly finished its work without me noticing the moment. The final step came in an email brief, formal policy update, no names, no stories, just a sentence. All performance reviews must include documented peer validation. Got sent. It closed the loop. Public humiliation could no longer hide behind authority. I sent the email, reviewed it twice, and hit send. That was it. No applause, no relief, just completion. On my way out, I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked the same, but I wasn't. He hadn't. When I had outlasted at home, I slept deeply for the first time in years. No rehearsing, no remembering, just rest. The next morning, the office buzzed, not with gossip, but with adjustment people. Adapting, they always do. Someone new joined the team and eager. They asked me for advice. I thought for a moment, then said, document your work and protect your integrity even when no one is watching. They nodded, not fully understanding. Yet as the weeks passed, the story faded, as all stories do. What remained was structure, and structure outlives emotion. I realized something important. The quietest endings are the most permanent, because there's no memory to fight against, no version to argue, just change. I never spoke their names again, not out of bitterness, out of closure. Asterisk. By the time the consequences finished unfolding, I was no longer a part of the story. That was the strangest part. Had waited so long, planned so carefully, and in the end I was just distant. News travels quietly. When people are embarrassed, you don't hear announcements. You hear gaps, a name missing from an email, a meeting reassigned, a signature replaced. That's how I learned. My former manager had moved on, not upward, not sideways out. No announcement, no farewell, just a line in an org chart that no longer existed. Daniel's story reached me indirectly through a former coworker. Over coffee, they spoke carefully, as if the words themselves might be contagious. He had taken another role at another company, lower level, less visibility. No one followed him. That silence, It told me everything I didn't feel triumph. I felt something closer to neutrality if I'd have returned something that never belonged to me, the anger, the memory, the weight at. Work, my role stabilized processes, improved, mistakes decreased. People trusted the system. More than individuals, that shift, it mattered because trust in people is fragile. Trust in structure is resilient. One afternoon, I received a message in internal survey. Optional, anonymous. One question caught my attention. Do you feel respected in your role? I paused, not because I doubted my answer, but because I remembered. When I wouldn't have known how to respond, I selected yes. Not proudly, just honestly. Time past the restaurant, the laughter, the humiliation, they blurred, not erased, but softened like scars that no longer ache. I ran into Daniel once accidentally at a conference. He looked thinner, older, tired. We nodded, no words. That moment, it closed something, not because we spoke, but because we didn't need to. I never ran into my manager again, not in person, but once. I saw his name on a document, reference removed, that absence. It felt heavier than seeing him. I thought about revenge, what it's supposed to look like: explosions, confrontations, apologies. But mine had been quiet, almost invisible. And that invisibility protected me from becoming what hurt me. Realized then I hadn't ruined them. They had ruined themselves. I had just stepped aside and stopped holding the pieces together. That distinction mattered because revenge that requires your constant presence keeps you trapped. But revenge that finishes itself sets you free at home. I packed away old notes, documentation, emails, not to hide them, but because they no longer define me. Thought about the title of this story. They humiliated me in public. Years later, I ruined them quietly. The word ruined felt inaccurate now. I didn't destroy. I withdrew support and systems, corrected imbalance. I had taken nothing from them. No apology, no validation. I had taken something else: control over my integrity, my silence, my patience. That was the real outcome, not their fall, but my release. By the time the story truly ended, there was nothing left to prove. No audience, no scoreboard, no victory speech, just quiet. I used to believe revenge needed witnesses, that it required acknowledgement and apology. A moment where someone finally says, was wrong, but real closure doesn't wait for permission, it arrives. When the past stops demanding your attention. Months passed, the office changed again, as it always does. New leaders, new priorities, new stories. Mine became just another rumor, half remembered, poorly told, and I was grateful for that because stories fade, but lessons stay. I noticed something about myself. I no longer flinched. When someone spoke sharply, I no longer shrank. In meetings, not because I had power, but because I had boundaries. The humiliation that once defined me had lost its voice, not because it was forgiven, but because it was understood. I thought often about that younger version of myself standing in that restaurant, smiling while being torn apart. I wish I could tell them something, not that it would get better, but that silence, when chosen, is not weakness. People think revenge is about pain. It's not. It's about imbalance, and imbalance always corrects itself. When you stop interfering, they humiliated me in public. Years later, they fell quietly, but not because I planned their destruction, because I refused to keep protecting their lies. That's the part people may see didn't attack. I didn't expose, I didn't threaten, I withdrew, and withdrawal is powerful asterisk the more or if someone humiliates you. They are betting on one thing: that you will react, that you will explode, defend, bag, leave. Because reactions give them control. But patience takes control away. Documentation takes control away. Silence, when paired with integrity, takes control away. You don't need to destroy anyone, you just need to stop holding them up. This story isn't about revenge, it's about dignity, about choosing who you become. After someone tries to make you small, some people scream, some people fight. I waited, and when the moment came, I didn't step forward, I stepped aside, because the most permanent revenge isn't loud, it doesn't celebrate, it doesn't even look like revenge, it looks like peace.